The digital clock on my nightstand glowed a sharp, unforgiving 1:42 a.m. on December 25th. Outside, the Chicago wind slammed against the window panes, driving a cruel sheet of dry snow horizontally down the street. Inside, the only light came from the blue, flickering glow of the television set. I sat huddled on my worn-out tweed armchair, pulling a wool blanket tighter around my shoulders. My left knee throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a souvenir from a bad fracture last winter, a constant reminder of my aging body. Then, the silence shattered. My phone lit up on the side table, buzzing violently. The screen flashed a name that made my chest tighten. Julian, my only son, 34 years old. I reached out with stiff fingers and answered on the second ring. Before I could speak, his voice burst through the speaker, frantic, breathless, and laced with absolute panic. Mom, are you watching this? Why on earth is your face on every single news station right now? I blinked, staring blankly at the dark television screen. My mind spun in sudden confusion. Julian, slow down, I managed, my voice raspy from sleep. What are you talking about? Channel 7, Mom, then Channel 2, the overnight storm coverage. His voice cracked, high-pitched and erratic. You're all over the local broadcast. People are sharing clips online. What on earth did you do? I rubbed my tired eyes, the skin on my palms still stinging from a minor cut earlier that evening. I looked from the phone to the television, the pieces refusing to click together. But even as he screamed questions, a heavy, cold weight settled deep in my stomach. Because just 7 hours earlier, sitting right here in this exact same chair, my son had made sure I knew I had no place in his life. Let me take you back. Just 7 hours before that call, the house had been entirely too quiet. My phone had rung then, too. When I saw Julian's name flash across the screen, a familiar, hopeful warmth had bloomed in my chest. Hey, kiddo, I had answered, smiling. Hi, Mom. Parents know. It doesn't matter if your child is 5 or 34. You can hear the shift in the air through a telephone wire. There was an unnatural stiffness, a rushed hesitation. Everything okay? I asked, my smile fading. Yeah, everything's fine. He cleared his throat. Dad and his new wife are hosting Christmas this year, at their place. My ex-husband, the man who had walked out on us 18 years ago, trading a struggling family for corporate luxury after marrying a wealthy real estate executive. I had spent nearly 2 decades picking up the pieces, raising Julian alone, working double shifts at a dry cleaner's just to keep us afloat, while my ex built an empire. I stayed silent, waiting. Mom? Julian's voice dropped lower, awkward and heavily rehearsed. We're trying to make things comfortable for everyone. You know how formal it is with Victoria's side of the family. Her father is a senior partner at the firm, and major investors will be there. I didn't say a word. I stared out the frosty window at the snow piling against my mailbox. So, Julian swallowed hard, the hesitation dripping with cowardice. Maybe it would be better if you sat this Christmas out, just for this year. We thought, well, your clothes, your old car in the driveway, it might not project the right image for the guests, and it would make things uncomfortable. You understand, right? The words settled into the quiet room slowly, like gray dust over old furniture. You understand, right? He was asking for my permission to erase me. He was trading his own mother for a seat at a rich man's table, terrified that my poverty and my wrinkles would embarrass him in front of his wealthy stepfamily. Yeah, I whispered, the word tasting like ash. I understand, Julian. Great, thanks, Mom. I knew you'd get it. Love you. Bye. The line went dead. I didn't cry. When you are 61 years old and life has beaten the theatrics out of you, crying feels like a waste of salt. I stood up, walked to the kitchen counter, and automatically reached for an extra dessert plate. I set it down on the formica surface, stared at it for a few long seconds, watching the empty space. Then slowly, I picked it back up and put it away in the cupboard. I didn't let the night end in self-pity. The next morning, despite the biting cold, I drove my old Ford pickup to the local pharmacy. I bought small gifts, but for Julian, I prepared something entirely different. For 2 full days, I sat at my wooden dining table and put together a heavy photo album. 35 years of memories, Polaroids of Julian taking his first steps in our cramped apartment, photos of his first day of kindergarten, pictures of me cheering in the freezing rain at his high school football games his father never attended, every milestone funded by my sweat and blood. On the final page, I wrote a short note. No matter how big your world becomes, never forget where your foundation was built. By Christmas Eve afternoon, the snow was falling in heavy sheets. I loaded the album and a box of pastries into the truck and drove across town to the affluent north suburbs. I parked outside the mansion. Warm lights glowed through the windows. Inside, people laughed together. Julian was in there, wearing an expensive suit bought with his father's money, laughing with people who wouldn't have glanced twice at him, carrying my last name. I didn't walk to the front door. Instead, I got out, walked quietly up the stone pathway, and placed the heavy photo album and gift box neatly on the porch. I stood there for a single second, listening to the muffled sound of laughter. Then, I turned around, walked back to my truck, and drove away into the storm, completely unaware that a twist of fate on a desolate highway was about to blow their exclusive world wide open. The heavy oak door of my ex-husband's mansion closed behind me with a silent click. I didn't wait for my old Ford to warm up. I just threw it into drive and steered back toward my empty house. Inside, the kitchen was freezing. The pilot light on the stove flickered blue in the draft. I sat down at the wooden table where I spent decades paying bills. My phone lay face up beside my cup of cold coffee. It stayed dark. No message, no missed call. Julian wasn't going to check if his mother made it home safely through a whiteout. He was currently sitting under glittering crystal chandeliers, carving prime rib with a father who replaced us, and a step-family that pretended I didn't exist. I had spent every Christmas Eve volunteering at St. Jude's for years. That night was no different. 2 hours later, the shelter closed early because of the storm. The drive home on Interstate 90 was a nightmare. Visibility had dropped to 0. The highway lanes had vanished beneath 6 inches of blinding powder. I kept my headlights on low beam, crawling forward at barely 20 miles per hour, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Then, past the exit for Mannheim Road, I saw it. Off to the shoulder, half subsided into a deep concrete drainage ditch, sat a full-size commercial transit van. Its hazard lights flashed a weak amber pulse against the roaring white curtain of the storm. Emblazoned on the side was the logo for the Oak Ridge Senior Care Facility. I didn't think twice. I pulled my truck hard onto the shoulder, threw it into park, and left the hazard lights blinking. The wind hit me like a physical blow, ripping my breath out of my lungs. Ice crystals tore at my face as I waded through knee-deep drifts toward the van. The driver's side door was jammed shut against the frozen slope. Inside, through the frosted glass, I could see shadows, panic-stricken faces pressing against the windows, elderly residents trapped inside a freezing metal van. I grabbed a heavy iron tire iron from the bed of my truck, waded back through the drift, and smashed it against the side passenger window until the safety glass shattered inward with a muffled pop. "Is everyone all right?" I screamed over the roar of the gale. An elderly woman inside was crying, clutching a woolen blanket. Up front, a terrified kid no older than 20 shouted back through the broken frame. "The battery's dead. The lift gate is jammed and a high-voltage utility line snapped down right across the rear axle. We can't step out or we'll get fried." My heart hammered against my ribs. 20 feet behind the van, a downed power line writhed and sparked wildly on the wet ground, spitting electricity into the snow. "Listen to me!" I yelled, adrenaline completely overriding the arthritis in my joints. "We aren't waiting for county rescue. We have to move them now, one by one." I climbed right onto the slick metal hood of the van, ignoring the stabbing pain in my knee. Reaching down through the jagged window frame, I grabbed a frail, trembling man by his heavy winter coat. With a grunt that tore at my lower back, I hoisted him up, balanced him on the freezing hood, and guided him down into the waist-deep snow toward my truck. As soon as I set him down beside the passenger door, the old man's frail fingers caught tightly around my trembling wrist. "Please don't leave us," he whispered, his voice shaking. I looked down into his frightened eyes and answered without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." For the next 20 minutes, operating purely on instinct and a stubborn fury, I became a machine. One by one, I pulled them out. 18 elderly residents, 18 frightened human beings who had been forgotten on the worst night of the year. By the time the screaming sirens of the local fire department finally cut through the wind, I was kneeling in the snow beside the last resident. My wool coat was soaked through with freezing slush. Firefighters swarmed the ditch, throwing down thermal blankets and shouting orders. A young paramedic rushed over to me, guiding me toward the warm interior of an ambulance. While he reached for a gauze pad, he stopped and looked down at my hands. "Ma'am, are those your gloves?" the paramedic asked, his eyes widening. I looked down. My bare hands were covered in deep cuts and smeared with dark blood. My wool gloves were missing, left somewhere deep in the frozen wreckage of the van. Before I could answer, a local news van pulled up behind the fire truck. The sliding door flew open, and a young field reporter, her hair whipped wild by the wind, holding a shivering cameraman, hopped out and waded toward the scene for a live shot. She spotted me sitting on the back step of the ambulance, shivering under the silver foil. The reporter shoved a microphone right toward my face. Her breath plumed white in the freezing air. Ma'am, I'm Sarah Lynn with Chicago Local News. You pulled nearly 20 seniors out of that ditch single-handedly before the county units even arrived. Tell our viewers at home, you must have a wonderful, loving family waiting back home right now, so proud of the hero they have under their roof on Christmas morning." She paused, holding the mic closer, smiling warmly, expecting a heartwarming holiday soundbite. I stared at the black foam of the microphone. I looked past her camera lens, out at the blinding wall of snow, and then down at my raw, bleeding hands. The exhaustion hit me all at once, heavy and absolute. I didn't smile. I let out a dry chuckle that sounded like stones grinding together. "No," I said, my voice hoarse, steady, and cutting straight through the wind noise. "Not tonight. My son told me not to come over. He said I didn't belong in his world, because his family's world is far too wealthy and important for someone like me." The reporter blinked, her professional smile freezing. "Pardon me? Your son? He's right over there, I suppose," I muttered, looking down at my boots. "Living large, and I'm just an old woman who doesn't fit the picture." I stood up, pulled the foil blanket tighter around my shoulders, and walked away into the dark, leaving the camera rolling. I had no idea that within 3 hours, that raw 30-second clip would be uploaded and shared across every major platform in the country, touching a raw nerve for thousands of parents discarded by their own children. My phone started buzzing at 6:30 a.m. and didn't stop for the next 4 hours. It wasn't holiday greetings. By sunrise, the 30-second clip of me wrapped in a foil emergency blanket had crossed 2 million views. By mid-morning, it was trending nationwide. The screen flashed with Julian's number over and over. When I finally slid my finger across to answer, his voice didn't sound like my son anymore. It was shrill, shaking with a toxic mix of white-hot fury and raw terror. "What were you thinking, Mom?" he yelled straight into the mic, his words tumbling over each other. "Are you completely insane? Do you have any idea what you've done? My phone hasn't stopped ringing for an hour. People are calling me a monster online. Protesters are gathering outside the firm's downtown office, and my boss is threatening to suspend me. Take it down. Call that reporter back and tell them you lied." Before I could even catch my breath to answer, another call buzzed through on call waiting. It was my ex-husband. I clicked over, and his cold corporate voice filled my ear, devoid of any human warmth, dripping with the arrogance of a man who measured everything in net worth. "Margaret," he said, not even bothering to say hello, "this little stunt of yours has caused absolute chaos. The firm's executives are furious. Victoria's family is furious, and our board members are demanding an explanation. You need to issue a public retraction immediately. Tell the press you were confused, exhausted, and that Julian takes excellent care of you. Do it now, or face the legal consequences of defamation." I listened to both of them, the son I spent 18 years sacrificing for, and the man who abandoned us for a checkbook. And for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. No guilt, no fear, just a cold, sharp clarity. I didn't lie about a single word, I told my ex softly and hung up. By afternoon, the internet had done what the internet does best. It went digging. Within hours, internet sleuths and independent content creators had completely exposed Julian's entire online footprint. His public profiles, which he had spent years curating to look like a self-made corporate high flyer, were laid bare for millions to see. People found years of carefully curated photos that never once included his mother. The internet turned on him with a vengeance. Hashtags branding him a selfish social climber trended across platforms. Brands he worked with quietly scrubbed his profile from their pages, and the elite social circle he had spent years trying to crawl into suddenly slammed their heavy oak doors right in his face. Later that evening, Julian let himself into my house, using the spare key he had kept for emergencies. The living room was dark, except for the amber glow of the street lamp outside. On the coffee table lay the heavy photo album I had left on his step the day before, still wrapped in its holiday ribbon, completely untouched. Julian stared down at it for a long, heavy moment. His fingers hovered over the cover, trembling slightly. He didn't pick it up. He didn't open it. He just slowly lowered his hand, set his keys down beside it, and walked back out into the cold, pulling the door shut behind him. By Tuesday afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside my small suburban house. A woman in a sharp wool coat stepped out, carefully navigating the icy patch on my walkway. She knocked twice, and when I opened the door, she held out a press badge. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Rachel Bennett, an investigative feature writer with the Chicago Chronicle," she said, her voice steady and respectful. "I'm not here for a quick tabloid soundbite. I want to tell the real story." Rachel spent the next 3 hours sitting at my worn-out kitchen table. She didn't ask about Julian, and she didn't care about my ex-husband's threats. Instead, she asked about the 14 years I had spent volunteering quietly at St. Jude's Community Center. "Did your mother always volunteer?" Rachel asked suddenly, glancing at a framed snapshot of the shelter. Julian, who had stepped back inside to drop off some paperwork, froze in the doorway. He didn't answer. He just looked down at the floor in absolute silence. Rachel looked through my old tax form, showing decades of honest labor as an independent neighborhood seamstress. The resulting piece, published 2 days later, ran as a full-page weekend feature. It painted a stark, unflinching portrait of two different Americas, one built on quiet, back-breaking sacrifice and genuine human dignity, and another built on shallow materialism, social climbing, and the cold abandonment of family ties. Reporters from national networks camped outside my driveway for days, offering thousands of dollars for exclusive sit-down interviews, morning show appearances, and tell-all exposés. I turned them all down. I didn't want a platform, I didn't want revenge, and I certainly didn't want to monetize my family's wreckage. When Rachel called to ask why I refused to fan the flames, I told her the simple truth. I said what I said because it was true. I don't need to destroy anyone to prove my worth. The truth speaks for itself. My quiet, unyielding refusal to play their media game didn't hurt my reputation. It cemented it. Ordinary people across the country sent letters, handmade cards, and small tokens of respect to my doorstep, praising a mother who finally chose her own self-respect over a lifetime of silent abuse. 2 weeks after the storm, the city of Chicago announced its annual Winter Hearts Award ceremony at the historic Palmer House Hotel. It was meant to be a glittering night, honoring local volunteers and civic heroes. Behind the scenes, however, corporate damage control was at work. My ex-husband and Julian's law firm had stepped in as major corporate sponsors, buying up a prominent VIP table right near the front stage. I later learned from a friendly TV producer that it was a calculated PR move, an attempt by Julian to rehabilitate his public image and pretend he was a supportive family member all along. I had no intention of going. When the formal invitation arrived in my mailbox, I tossed it straight onto the kitchen counter. But the city mayor's office called directly the next morning, insisting that the award committee had unanimously voted to honor my roadside rescue. They made it clear that my absence would only create an even bigger media spectacle, dragging out a story that was already exhausting me. So, on a crisp Friday evening, I brushed off a clean dark blue blazer I had mended years ago, pinned my hair back, and walked through the grand marble doors of the Palmer House alone. The ballroom was breathtaking under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. At the front, sitting prominently at the center VIP table under glowing spotlights, were Julian and my ex-husband. Julian wore a tailored charcoal tuxedo, his jaw set tight, staring straight ahead at his dessert plate as if the rest of the room didn't exist. When my name echoed across the loudspeakers, the applause started softly near the back and swelled into a roaring standing ovation. Hundreds of faces turned toward me as I walked steadily down the aisle, keeping my head high, feeling the soft click, click, click of camera shutters, capturing every step of an old woman in a thrift store jacket stepping onto a high-end stage. The city's chief alderman stepped forward, smiling warmly, and handed me a heavy crystal plaque. Then, the master of ceremonies, a well-known local news anchor, stepped to the center podium, holding out his microphone for a brief closing question. The auditorium instantly quieted down, hanging on his every word. "Mrs. Miller," the host asked smoothly, his voice carrying clearly through the massive sound system, You pulled 18 elderly people out of a freezing wreckage in whiteout conditions while injured yourself. Looking back at that terrifying night, what was the hardest part of the entire ordeal? He smiled, expecting a standard heartwarming reply about braving the elements or the triumph of community spirit. I didn't answer right away. I stood there under the blinding stage lights, the heavy crystal cold in my palms. Slowly, deliberately, I turned my gaze away from the host and looked down at the front row. My eyes locked directly onto Julian. For a brief, piercing second, the glittering ballroom faded away. I didn't see the slick, successful corporate lawyer sitting in a custom tuxedo. Instead, I saw a small boy with a gap-toothed smile standing in our cramped, drafty kitchen, clutching a faded blue ribbon from his first-grade spelling bee and looking up at me with pure, unadulterated pride. Julian's face went completely bloodless. He froze, his glass of champagne hovering halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with sheer panic as he realized what was happening. Beside him, my ex-husband stiffened, his fingers curling tightly around the edge of the white tablecloth. I leaned into the microphone, my voice steady, clear, and quiet enough that every single person in that massive hall had to lean forward to catch every word. Rescuing people in a blizzard isn't difficult, I said, letting the words hang in the heavy air. And the cold weather, the physical freezing, that isn't terrifying at all. The hardest part of that night wasn't the storm. I paused for a long, heavy beat, watching the color drain entirely from my son's face. The hardest part, I continued, speaking with a calm, absolute clarity, was realizing that the son I spent my entire life working myself to the bone to raise looked at me and saw someone whose very presence would stain his reputation and ruin his seat at a wealthy table. A collective gasp swept through the front rows like a physical wave. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpeted floor. No cameras clicked. No whispers echoed off the golden pillars. Every eye in the Palmer House ballroom darted from the stage down to the VIP table. Julian couldn't take it anymore. The composure he had spent weeks practicing shattered completely. He dropped his head into his shaking hands, his shoulders heaving as hot, humiliated tears finally broke through. Beside him, his powerful, wealthy stepfather slowly lowered his head, pressing his palms flat against the table and refusing to look up as hundreds of disapproving stares converged on them from every corner of the room. I looked out over the sea of silent, stunned faces, gave a quiet nod to the host, and stepped away from the podium. When the lights went down and the applause finally died away, I stepped off the stage and walked toward the quiet green room near the service exit. I wanted my coat, my purse, and a quiet exit into the cold Chicago night before the cameras could follow me back out to the street. Before I could even reach for the door handle, footsteps echoed rapidly down the carpeted hallway. "Mom! Mom! Wait!" Julian burst through the double doors, breathing hard, his expensive tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and slightly crooked. Before I could take a step back, he closed the distance between us, threw his arms around my shoulders, and buried his face right against my neck, sobbing like a child. As he held me, an involuntary memory flashed through my mind. The last time my son had hugged me like that was 20 years ago, after he scraped his knee falling off his bicycle at age 12, crying in our cramped kitchen while I wiped away his tears. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice cracking against my coat. "I'm so sorry, Mom. Please, please forgive me for Christmas. I was an idiot. I was blind. I didn't mean any of it. I stood there inside his desperate embrace, my arms hanging stiffly at my sides. 14 years ago, that kind of warmth and apology would have broken my heart in a second. I would have held him tight, stroked his hair, and told him everything was fine. But tonight, there was no warmth left in my chest, just a heavy, echoing hollow. Julian pulled back slightly, his hands gripping the lapels of my old blue blazer, his fingers shaking. "You saw what happened out there," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the hallway door as if waiting for a camera crew to jump out from the shadows. "The board of directors is emergency meeting tomorrow morning. They're talking about stripping my marketing director title. They think I'm toxic. If you just post a quick video tomorrow saying it was all a misunderstanding, or that we've already worked things out privately, they'll drop it. Everything can go back to normal. We can fix this, Mom." That was it. Right there in those frantic, desperate words. The absolute truth of his tears was laid bare. He wasn't crying because he had broken his mother's heart. He was crying because his career was crumbling, because his elite social standing was slipping through his fingers, and because the world finally saw him for who he really was. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up and peeled his fingers away from my jacket, one by one. I didn't jerk away. I didn't shove him. I just gently, firmly removed his hands and took a step back. My voice didn't shake. It was quiet, steady, and completely flat. "Stop crying, Julian," I said softly. He stared at me, his mouth half open, stunned by the absolute coldness in my eyes. "Next year," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. "Next year, we can do things differently, right? We can spend the holidays together at the house, like a real family. Things can go back to how they used to be once all this media noise blows over, can't they?" I looked at my son, this grown man in a $1,000 suit who still thought love was a utility switch he could flip on and off, depending on what was convenient for his resume. "No, Julian," I answered, my tone as steady as stone. "They can't." "Mom, I am still your mother, Julian," I interrupted, cutting him off before he could start bargaining. "If you are ever truly sick, if you are ever starving or in real trouble, you know where I live. My door has never been locked to you, but my life and my home are too small for your pride. They are too small for the conditions you put on our relationship, and they are too small for the shame you feel just looking at me." I reached for my canvas handbag resting on the side table, looping the strap over my shoulder. "Don't come looking for me because a newspaper article makes you look bad," I continued, looking straight into his wide, panicked eyes. "And don't call me just because society tells you a good son is supposed to check a box on a holiday. A mother's love isn't a spare jacket hanging in a closet, Julian. You don't get to throw it out in the snow when it doesn't match your new clothes, and you don't get to pull it back on just because you're freezing." Julian stood frozen in the middle of the quiet room. The color drained entirely from his face as the weight of my words finally sank deep into his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out, just a shallow, ragged breath. He realized with a sickening clarity that the one thing he had always taken for granted, a mother's unconditional, endless tolerance, was gone for good. I didn't wait for him to find his voice. I turned my back and pushed open the heavy service door. As I stepped toward the exit, Julian made a sudden move to follow me, half raising his hand as if to call out, but he stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't take another step, and he didn't call out. For the very first time in his life, he stood completely still and respected my boundary. I walked out into the cool night air alone, knowing for the first time in my life that I was finally free. 3 months after the Palmer House ceremony, I sat across from a quiet estate attorney in a cramped downtown office to rewrite my will. For years, everything I owned was designated to go straight to Julian, every dollar saved from mending clothes, every equity scrap from the small house. Not anymore. I divided my assets carefully, a modest trust for St. Jude's Community Center, a dedicated educational fund for local underprivileged youths learning trade skills, and a single symbolic token left for Julian to remind him of self-reliance. When the papers were signed and sealed, a weightless peace settled over my chest. I wasn't punishing my son. I was simply acknowledging that my life belonged to me again. My days at St. Jude's shifted from a quiet escape into something far warmer. Among the 18 elderly residents I had pulled from that freezing van on Christmas Eve was Clara Vance, a 76-year-old retired high school literature teacher. Clara was sharp-tongued, endlessly witty, and possessed a piercing, no-nonsense clarity about human nature that kept everyone on their toes. The first time we sat down together with cups of weak black coffee in the shelter's break room, she looked over her reading glasses at me and didn't mince words. "I saw that viral clip, Margaret," Clara said, taking a slow sip, "and I read the newspaper feature. You spent decades bending over backward for a man who traded you in and a boy who grew up ashamed of your calloused hands. Tell me, why did it take a blizzard and a smashed car window for you to finally drop the burden?" I stared at her for a moment, caught off guard by her bluntness, and then let out a real, genuine laugh, the first one I had allowed myself in years. "I suppose I just ran out of patience," I replied. "Good." Clara smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Patience is a wasted virtue on people who treat your devotion like background noise. Now, are you going to sit around feeling sorry for the past? Or are we going to put those sewing skills of yours to work?" Within a month, Clara and I launched a free weekend sewing and tailoring workshop at the community center for teenagers and young adults who wanted to learn a practical trade. Clara handled the registration and discipline with the iron-fisted charm of a veteran educator, while I sat at the sewing machines guiding young hands through fabric, threads, and patience. One Saturday afternoon, a quiet teenage boy hurried over to my station, holding up a denim jacket with an uneven collar and a proud, nervous grin. "Miss Margaret, I finally did it," he whispered, pointing directly at his handiwork. I adjusted a stray piece of thread with my silver scissors and smiled warmly back at him. For the first time in my life, my hands weren't just fixing torn hems to pay the bills. They were building confidence in kids who felt just as invisible as I once had. As for Julian, our dynamic shifted into something entirely unfamiliar. He didn't call me every day anymore, and he certainly didn't show up unannounced expecting a hot meal or a laundry service. True to my boundary, our contact became measured and deliberate. Once a month, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Julian would drive out to the suburbs in his car. Not the luxury imported sports cars from his old life, but a modest sedan he had bought himself after his stepfamily's firm quietly pushed him out of his director position. Our lunches were brief, polite, and initially wrapped in heavy layers of awkwardness. He would sit at my kitchen table, sipping tea, carefully weighing every word he spoke. There were no expensive gifts, no hollow promises of grandeur, and no attempts to sweep the past under the rug. During one of those afternoon visits, as he walked out toward the porch, he noticed a loose, rotting wooden slat on the front fence. Without saying a word to me, Julian walked back to his car trunk, pulled out a heavy hammer and a box of spare nails, and quietly spent 10 minutes hammering the loose planks firmly into place. Standing by the kitchen window, I watched him wipe the dust from his hands. No one had asked him to do it. and he didn't mention it when he came back inside. Before leaving that afternoon, Julian picked up his empty ceramic teacup from the table, carried it over to the sink, washed it thoroughly under the tap, and placed it neatly back in the exact center of the drying rack. I didn't say a word. I simply watched from the doorway as he finished his quiet task. He swallowed hard, blinking back moisture in his eyes, and gave me a small, fragile nod of understanding. He finally realized the truth. The unconditional sacrifice was gone, replaced by something far more enduring, a real, mutual respect between two adults who shared blood, but no longer shared illusions. I walked him out to his car that afternoon as the spring sun broke through the clouds, melting the last stubborn patches of winter snow off the pavement. As his car pulled away down the quiet street, I didn't feel lonely. I turned back toward my house, locked the front door behind me, and walked into a kitchen that finally felt entirely like my own. A full year has slipped past since that freezing night on Interstate 90 and the blinding, chaotic flash of the Palmer House ballroom. Time has a funny way of smoothing out the sharpest, most jagged edges of a story, leaving behind only the things that truly matter. Tonight, winter has returned to Chicago once again, wrapping the entire city in a familiar, heavy blanket of pristine white snow. I sat in my favorite worn armchair right by the living room window, listening to the soft, rhythmic clicking of knitting needles. Across from me, Clara was comfortably settled into the deep corner sofa, a steaming, oversized mug of herbal tea cradled gently between her hands, her sharp eyes scanning the squares of a Sunday crossword puzzle. Outside the frosted glass, the evening sky turned the color of bruised slate, and the bare, shivering branches of the old oak tree caught the pale amber glow of the street lamp below. There was no phone resting anxiously on the coffee table, no screen flashing with missed calls, no hollow, agonizing waiting for a ringing line that used to dictate the rhythm of my entire existence. For 35 long years, I had made the fatal mistake of tying my entire sense of self-worth to keeping impossible people happy. I had bent over backward, sacrificing every ounce of my youth and energy for a husband who eventually traded me away for a higher tax bracket, and a son who grew up looking right through me as if I were made of invisible glass. I thought love meant enduring anything, absorbing every slight, and shrinking myself down until I took up as little space as possible. It took a blinding blizzard, a smashed car window, and a cold winter night to finally teach me what a tragic waste all of that sacrifice had been. I had to almost freeze to death to realize that I deserved to be warm. I looked around my small living room. The walls were no longer bare. They were covered in framed photographs of my students from the community center, vibrant fabrics from the sewing workshop, and candid snapshots of Clara and me laughing over burnt toast in the shelter kitchen. My life was full, chaotic, and brimming with genuine human connection that didn't demand I sacrifice my dignity to earn it. "Penny for your thoughts, Margaret," Clara said softly, lowering her ink pen and looking over the rim of her reading glasses as the firelight danced across her silver hair. I smiled, taking a slow, comforting sip from my own mug of chamomile tea. The heat radiated through my palms. Just thinking about how quiet the snow sounds when you're finally warm inside. Clara gave a knowing, solemn nod, her lips curving into a warm, approving grin that felt like a quiet victory. "It's amazing what happens when you stop setting yourself on fire just to keep ungrateful people warm, isn't it?" She was right. The greatest, most profound redemption in this life isn't screaming matches or public destruction. It's walking away with your head held high, quietly building a beautiful life of your own out of the wreckage, and refusing to throw a lifeline to those who only remember your name when the curtain goes down. I didn't need to chase validation anymore. My phone buzzed once on the side counter. I glanced at the screen. A simple text message from Julian lit up the quiet room. Sunday at 1? I tapped out a brief reply. See you then. I set the phone back down on the counter without a single trace of anxiety, guilt, or hope. It was just an appointment, nothing more. I turned my eyes back to the window. I picked up my knitting needles and resumed the steady, rhythmic clicking of yarn. Clara settled back against her sofa cushions, pencil poised over her crossword puzzle. Outside the frosted glass, the heavy white snow fell silently against the street, blurring the harsh city lights into a warm, golden haze. My hands were steady. My home was my own. And for the first time in my entire life, the winter cold couldn't touch me. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.